Good morning to all. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you. I'm José Luis Caballero, Commissioner. Let's begin then. Hearing 15th of the 199th period of sessions on the right of free association in Cuba. This is a very important hearing, and we welcome the civil society representatives that have requested this hearing by Cuba Lex, civil rights offenders, Damas de Blanco, Instituto de Raza, Igualdad y Derechos Humanos, Justicia, 11, Mesa de Diálogo de la Juventud Cubana, Movimiento San Isidro, Museo Virtual de la Memoria contra la Violencia de Género, Museo de la Disidencia, Observatorio de Género de Alas Tensas, Robert Kennedy Human Rights, y Unión Patriótica de Cuba. So all of these have requested the hearing. So here with me at the head table is Commissioner Pardo Ralón, the rapporteur for Cuba, and I have the Executive Secretary Tania Renal, and the rapporteur for freedom of expression, Mr. Vaca, and of course, Gloria de Mesc, and rapporteur Javier Palumo for economic rights and environmental rights. Economic and environmental rights. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is celebrating its 65th year of being committed to defending human rights and promoting them. Thanks to the interest and common agreement for promoting these human rights. And this then gave life to the Democratic Inter-American Charter. Since 1959, hundreds of people, professionals, have come to this institution. Thousands of peoples, collective groups, and peoples have come here requesting protection, justice, and reparation. So 165 years of history with more than 100 visits in loco, and its reports more than 1,000 cautionary measures that were granted, 220 amicable solutions, and 377 cases sent to the Inter-American Court. All of that with the victims as a central axis of our work and our priority. In order to ensure that this audience is inclusive, we request that all participants begin their presentations first saying their name, their position, and the organization or institution that they represent. After this, each time that you again request the floor, we will be grateful if you again say your name at the beginning so that those people that cannot see can identify who is speaking. In the same manner, we will remind you that these hearings have subtitles on the Zoom platform, and each person can activate them directly from their devices and select the size of what they're looking at. This is also available for people that are following us on our channels of the Commission. So before we begin the presentation from civil society, I just want to say what the time periods will be. Civil society will have 30 minutes beginning now, and then the Inter-American Commission another 30 minutes, and we will close with comments again from civil society for another half hour. And you have the floor, civil society. Ladies and gentlemen of the Commission for Human Rights, I am Larissa. It is an honor to represent this group to present this systematic repression of freedom of expression in Cuba. And because of the law 1370 that is strangling the civic space and cutting off this freedom of expression and association. In spite of reforms that make this more profound, this restriction, and the political action of the Communist Party, and obstructing any type of independent association, we're here before this commission to acknowledge the reality of this situation. We request that you allow for or ask of the government that will allow for a free association in Cuba and systematic thing. They are trying to dismantle anything from civil society, and they're focusing on these practices are manifested by neutralizing leadership, where they demobilize and weaken associations of their more representative actions. So this implies their detentions and violence. The people that do this are intimidating their following people, and in that way they avoid participation in anything that they think threatens the regime. So all of this freedom of expression is restricted. They do not allow for having events or any type of meeting. And access to information is also, they block websites of civil society and anything that criticizes the government, and it limits the capacity to disseminate information or search for support. So these organizations are the delegitimization of this and their members, and calling them traitors, mercenaries, or terrorists. So they try to undermine public support. So these strategies are an integrated focus that represses civil society if it is independent in Cuba. So it limits their capacity to operate freely, make changes, and criticize the government. The organizations that requested this hearing, that petitioned this hearing, delineates everything that I have mentioned. And now Ferrer Tamayo will share his experiences of the serious difficulties they're facing that civil society faces in Cuba. Good morning. My name is Julio Alfredo Ferrer Tamayo. I'm an attorney in Cuba, and I work in Havana, from where I have traveled to speak before the Commission and say what my opinion is of these situations we are facing for independent civil society in Cuba. These organizations are being continuously harassed by forms of repression from the state. They use a strategy to systematically disarticulate us. So this is extremely intense, and it threatens to eradicate the presence of civil society in Cuba. These repression methods then they attack members and their families, and judicial processes that try to neutralize leaders. And this is part of their strategy that is done also by forced exile of these leaders or families. And they harass and do also psychological pressure against the members of the Damas de Blanco, who are constantly being persecuted. And Berta Soler, their leader, is just held to their house. She has to stay in her home. Repression then is broadened to going to their offices, and one of these people had them enter their office and have all the members of his association be forced to exilate. The jailing and incarceration is another method of repression, and it is punishment and used as a type of intimidation that tries to disarticulate all these civil society associations in Cuba. So my path with all this began in 2001 when I left the collective office at a national level, because I was looking for a fair exercise of justice and that respects human rights. So the beginning of my relations with civil society was this way, in this manner. My first experience, my first important experience, was with the Asociación Jurídica Cubana, where I tried to obtain legal recognition following the established requirements. And in spite of my complying with all the certifications required and presenting legal recourse to the authorities, my efforts were systematically ignored and rejected. We even took this to the Supreme Tribunal that acknowledged and recognized the right to request this, but this was denied. And I had a similar situation with Cuba Ley, where their responses were evasive and they rejected us, even though we meticulously followed and complied with their requirements. This underlined a general knowledge about the law and legalization for the population to have any of these types of associations or groups. The Cuban state is presenting obstacles to all of these types of actions. And the knowledge of the law and the legal recourse that one has that will facilitate the legalization of these organizations have been studied, but it is very disillusioning to find out that the Cuban authorities deny and absolutely do not acknowledge the existence of all of this and are rejecting. So this closes all possibility of recognition, legal recognition that we exist or that we want to exist legally. So all these independent organizations from civil society, I tell them, continue the fight and the battle to try and obtain this legal recognition and existence as a legal person. So I would ask the international community to support all these organizations. It is crucial to have coordination, to put some pressure on the Cuban authorities so that they respect the rights of these organizations. Regarding my vision for the future, it is true that the panorama for these civil society organizations that are independent in Cuba is not encouraging because of the systematic repression that they are suffering. But I am convinced that the fight for human rights and justice is a just cause and an essential cause. So we must continue doing what we're doing. And even though our efforts and aspirations are difficult, equity, equality, and dignity for human rights and respect for human dignity are necessary. Thank you very much for listening to my words. Good morning. My name is Joana Villegas, and I represent the Instituto de Raza y Derecho and the Damas de Blanco, an independent civil society organization. The Damas de Blanco in 2023 were repressed systematically by the Cuban state, and the tactics of arbitrary detentions, short detentions, criminalization, and constant vigilance, and this has diminished the number of members of the Damas Blancas from to 50 people for 143. And this harassment of the Damas de Blancos has been recognized by other international groups and regional groups and human rights from the United Nations that have requested of the Cuban state to stop this violence against these groups and families and their families. Berta Soler, the leader of the Damas Blancas, suffered this. For more than 20 years, the repressive force of the communist regime of Cuba has not ceased in persecuting, harassing, and bothering for political reasons our organization. They have used 19 repressive different methods in order to disarticulate our organization. Amongst these repressive methods, we can point out the following. Guarantee to get to the United States by way of a third country. That this includes payment of tickets and other expenses to get there. Then harassment against families of those people, especially mothers, sons, and husbands. Detainment and jailing of family members, youngs and other members of the family, the youth and other members of the family. Invented crimes to justify detainment or jailing. High costs of paying for these, and within social media, making them lose prestige, inside and outside Cuba. Detainment and having some people disappear for 48, 24, or 72 hours on any given day of the week. To have the detained women 1 or more hours with handcuffs and being hermetically sealed in the sun in vehicles that are closed to make them feel like they're asphyxiating. Today, as an expression of this new repression, 5 of the Damas de Blanco were taken their freedom away for political reasons. And they were placed with dangerous criminals. Their names are Aymara Nieto, Sailí Navarro, Cici Abascal, Tana Echevarria, and Jacqueline Heredia. For these brave political prisoners in Cuba and for all Cuban political prisoners, we ask of you once more your solidarity. Finally, we would also request the Commission, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, that they intercede to have all Cuban political prisoners be freed and to have this communist regime to ask them to conclude and end this repression and political persecution and demand of the regime to also desist on criminalizing the rights of Cubans to protest and have political meetings and protest. Good morning. I am Camila Rodriguez, and I direct the working group on political detainments and the Center of Demarcation of Jails of Cuba. So part of this lack of the right, we know that there are 78 women have been jailed for this reason, even though most of them were detained because of public protests. 12 of them belonged to these groups. So the protests were a pretext to take their freedom away and put them in jail for more than 10 years. So we have 5 women that are detained that belong to the Damas de Blanco, 4 from Julio Machado, 3 from the Asociación Libres de Cuba, and 2 from the Republican Party or Partido Republicano de Proa, and 1 for Nueva República, 1 from the Movimiento Democracia, 1 Vuelta Abajo, 1 from the Partido por la Democracia, Luis Botel, and 2 from the Unión Patriótica of Cuba, 2 from Cuba Decide, and 2 from Partido Pro Derecho in Cuba, and 1 from the Council of the Rapporteurs of Human Rights. Along with these, the political prisoners have a very serious taking of their rights and within the penitentiary system, because the number of women that are being affected are less, even though they're less than men. What these people have told us is they're suffering severe conditions, especially those who are mothers, or if they're part of the LGBTQ communities. Those women in Cuban prisons face extremely precarious situations in these prisons, lack of hygiene facilities, and not enough drinking water and for hygiene. So the treatment of these detained people are systematically aggravated because of harassment and repression, including putting them in punishment cells and being beaten. And this is an abuse of power and institutionalized violence that is directed not only to punish, but also to silence and control these women that are detained. The negative impact of this on the mental health of these women, and that in extreme cases could lead to suicide, but there are other psychological demonstrations that they're being affected. So the lack of information and opacity of what the conditions are in these prisons reflect this lack of transparency and responsibility of the Cuban government, and they're putting obstacles to anyone that tries to defend human rights and the international community that tries to support. So from 2013, the Cuban state has not updated what's happening with the women that are detained. And there is a lack of actions to prevent these systematic abuses. So it is imperative that the prison conditions are improved and stop repression against those women that are detained. International community should intensify the repression on the Cuban regime to guarantee the protection of human rights of all people that are detained, reaffirming the global commitment for human dignity. So we'd like to say that the international community is supporting in support of freedom or other measures when people are taken their freedom away. And so for Lisandra Gomez and Jacqueline Heredia, we have also documented actions against the families of some of these people, especially those that are related to the protests of 11th of July. And they're trying to dissuade any type of opposition or activism, so therefore limit free association. So we will now have the testimony of Jenny Tawada, who is the mother of Isabel Tawada, or Juan Isabel, who was then jailed for 14 years. Well, I am Jenny Tawada. I am the mother of the political prisoner. And he was jailed because of the protests of 11th of July in 2021 in Cuba. My son is presently in prison at a high maximum prison. He was arrested on July 16th of 2021. It was a violent arrest where what was seen was a private vehicle with 8 people who were not identified and were not dressed with any uniform for the authorities in Cuba. They were very aggressive and violent. They beat him up. And the next day, on the 17th of July, I started looking for my son desperately because there were many people looking for their family members that they did not know where they were. 2 days later, I found out that my son was at this investigation center where he was there for 45 days until he was transferred to a detainment prison that is called Valle Grande. On 11th of July, the 11th of July changed my life, my family's life, and this has been a constant suffering with very sad consequences. And my youngest daughter of 13 years old, she is sick because of nerves and other things that I would like not to mention, but she is under psychiatric treatment and she's living experiences, and I'm living experiences that a mother should never have to go through. All of this adding to the repression that I have constantly suffered because I am a mother that decided to speak out and not just let the injustice committed against my son go. And because of my protests and my claims, I have been repressed, I have been detained, my leaving my home has been limited, I've been victim of much repression. And right now, it hurts to mention this because it has been a part of my life that has left marks on me, not good ones. Presently, my son, Duan Isabel Leon Taboada, is in an isolated cell. First, he went through a week of a punishment cell, and my son has been the victim of torture, mistreatment, not good medical attention at this prison. This last event where he was beaten by a prison guard while he was handcuffed, they threw him against the floor with his handcuffs on, and he beat him. So I ask of the international community to be sensitive to this. I'm trying to touch your hearts. As a mother that is giving the best she can of herself to fight for her son, her children, her family. And I ask you to support us because united we can have a much louder voice for freedom, that we have justice, that we are able to be free.
Good morning, I'm Janelis Núñez, and I am here representing the Museum of Dissidents in Cuba and the Observatory of Gender, Las Tensas. I am the coordinator there. Institutional gender violence is exercised by the Cuban state, especially against women and carers who are involved in activism. And this has been seen in an alarming way through coercion, defamation campaigns, not allowing them to communicate, and threats of taking away custody of their children. This type of violence can be considered a type of torture or cruel treatment, and it is a serious violation of human rights. They're trying to inhibit activism and silence the voices of civil society. Cuba's Code of Families allows for the suspension of parental rights for vague reasons, and this opens the door to discretionality and arbitrariness by the state. The violence exercised by authorities as well as by private citizens manifests itself in repressive actions such as official citations that are illegal, arbitrary detentions, using torture and mistreatment on the families of activists as a way to pressure them and to punish them. Cases such as a case of a 3-year-old girl, Lady Cataro Naranjo, is the daughter of Israel Naranjo Perez, a political prisoner, or a child of Sai Núñez, the wife of Michael Goya, who after the arrest of his father has severe depression, and doctors have diagnosed alopecia and skin lesions for nervous reasons. Or the case of Marisol Peña Coba's family. She was forced into exile because she was threatened threatened that her children would be taken away. So this shows how this violence is extended even to the most vulnerable of people in Cuba. And these practices seek to punish activists and their children, and also to make them afraid and to lose courage if they were trying to be part of the struggle for human rights. And there's an absence of specific laws against gender violence, and populist punitivism by Cuban authorities is the way that they deal with gender violence. Due diligence in the investigation of threats and acts of violence is absent, so there's a cycle of impunity. Cuba was the country of Latin America with the greatest increase of femicides in 2023. 150% respect to last year. These data are alarming when we see that since 2019 up until now, the Alastensas observatories and Yo Si Te Creo, I Do Believe You in Cuba, have recorded 117 cases. This, together with a lack of adequate protection for victims, a lack of state prevention mechanisms, and the criminalization of independent groups that are also not allowed to associate freely. These are signs of the vulnerability of women in Cuba within political circles and even outside of them. In terms of the Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white, there have been physical and verbal aggression against them by the regime, and this underlines the context of repression and discrimination that they face. These women are subjected to cruel treatment because of their gender, identity, sexual orientation, or race, in trying to dissuade them from participating in social protests and silencing their desire for democracy. This requires urgent attention by the international community and by human rights organizations. It is crucial to increase pressure on the Cuban government so that they will cease this violence against women. They will set the women prisoners free, and human rights of all people are guaranteed, and they must commit to respecting political plurality and human dignity. Thank you very much.
Buenos días.
Good morning. I'm Sofia Jaramillo. I'm the senior attorney for the Kennedy Human Rights. Faced with this alarming situation presented by my colleagues, and which is also in the report that has been submitted to you, our coalition made up of civil rights defenders, Cuba Lex, Damas de Blanco, the Institute on Equality and Human Rights and Race, the 11J, the Dialogue Table for the Cuban Youth, the San Isidro Movement, Museum of Dissidents, the Virtual Museum of Memory Against Gender-Based Violence, the Gender Observatory, Kennedy Association, etc. We request of this Honorable Commission, first, a public statement demanding that the Cuban state immediately set free those people deprived of freedom for political reasons, to cease systematic persecution and the practice of forced exile on those people who try to practice their right to free association. Second, recognize limits to free association in Cuba and the effect against activists and their families through follow-up resolutions. Third, demand that the Cuban state fulfill its international obligations in human rights, in particular regarding the life, liberty, personal integrity, and protection against arbitrary detention. Fourth, including our documentation in Chapter 4B of the annual report of 2023, talking about the specific cases that we've presented here. 5, requesting an extraordinary session of the Permanent Council of the OAS to present this situation and violations of human rights that are taking place in Cuba. 6, urge human rights protection organizations, others, to make a statement about the lack of a right to free association in Cuba. We are seeking to make the human rights situation in Cuba more visible, and also to get the necessary support and intervention to guarantee the protection and respect of human rights there. We are counting on you, on your commitment in this struggle for human rights and human dignity. Thank you very much for conveying this information to us. and for this important set of information and facts that you are providing to the Commission. Let's go on to our next interventions. I'll give the floor, first of all, to Commissioner Estuardo Ralón, Rapporteur for Cuba and People Deprived of Freedom. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to warmly welcome the representatives of civil organizations of Cuba. This is now the beginning of my 5th year as a commissioner and rapporteur for Cuba. And in these 4 years, we've been able to work together, and I can attest to the very significant work that you have carried out. Faced with so much adversity, it's a constant struggle to give voice to those who do not have one. And this work, these efforts have made it possible for us to have an agenda that seeks to make visible the serious violations of human rights taking place on the island, and also to issue a situational report on human rights, and in addition to that, provide follow-up to the various peaks of a crisis that remains because it's part of the daily life of Cubans with these systematic human rights violations. This starting point, I'd like to say that the reason why this hearing is taking place in the context of the 189th session is because of the commitment of OAS in terms of making sure that this situation on the island is not normalized, or that we do not normalize these serious violations of human rights. During each session, we receive many requests for a hearing, and the reason that it has been granted today to these organizations is that so you could, not just those of you who are here in person, we also have a virtual guests who have expressed themselves so that you can show what the situation is, so that we can make sure that this situation is not invisible to the rest of us. You have reported something that I think is evident. The communist regime failed in human rights, given that what we see today is systematic violation, not just of freedom of expression or freedom of association, but also of all rights inherent to human beings. You have said that dissidence is criminalized. You have shown that civil society organizations are dismantled. Any type of desire for freedom is repressed in any area. There is a stigmatization and a labeling on the media of any person who is a dissident vis-a-vis the regime. You have shown that there is a climate of repression through various mechanisms that are used. Government leaks, they neutralize leaders. There's constant persecution, such as what was described from the perspective of the ladies in white. Why? Why does this repression exist? Why does this stigmatization exist? Because something is being asked for through that leadership, and what is being demanded is freedom. What is being asked for is democracy, and that's the reason why only a democratic transition, only democratic conditions can guarantee that there will be respect for human rights on the island. You yourselves have expressed that it's very important that this be a general call to the international community, a request for those systematic human rights violations to be stopped. And in this regard, the Commission, through the instruments within its reach, press releases, hearings such as this one, is within its competence and with the tools that it has, it is attempting to be a voice. But it is a voice that needs to be accompanied by other voices. There needs to be empathy from various other international institutions who should join their voices with ours. We've heard today how you've said through your testimonies and through the testimony of Berta Soler that there have been attacks on using at least 19 different repressive methods against the damas de blanco, the ladies in white, bullying of the families, harassment of the families, detaining, the arresting of the families, defamation campaigns. Even they make people disappear for short periods of time. And within that testimony, it was said that it was important for a call to be put out, not just now during this hearing, but in general, and the Commission has done that, and we reiterate it during this hearing, that is a call on Cuba to set free all the political prisoners and those who are in prison for reasons of conscience. And in addition to that, Berta said in her testimony that she wants the regime to be demanded to put an end to repression and to this criminal behavior. So it has to be many voices asking for the same thing. And the Commission today, in support of your enormous struggle, the Commission adds its voice to that demand. And that commitment of our Commission to human rights and to human dignity is a voice that should be unanimous on the part of the international community. In this testimony also that we heard virtually from a mother who is asking for help for her son who is deprived of freedom, she said something that was very powerful. Together, we can produce a very powerful scream out for freedom. And we can together demand an end to that repression. As a rapporteur, I also take note of the request that you've made regarding a specific public statement on the release of the political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. And please be sure that we will take that request seriously and we will map out a course of action so we can produce a statement of this kind, in addition to demanding that human rights be respected and that no systematic violation of human rights occurs. With this type of report that you have presented at different times, not just during this hearing, the Commission has been reporting these in Chapter 4B of the annual report. And so on that basis, the Commission also takes note of the request that you have made today. Perhaps in conclusion, I'd like to ask a question of you so that perhaps you can provide more information when you take the floor. What is the differentiated impact of repressive measures on women who are activists and human rights advocates on the island? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner Ralón. Commissioner Gloria de Messi would like, she's the rapporteur for elderly adult persons. She would like to make a comment.
Before I start, I want to apologize for entering this session a bit later. But the report and the testimonies given, I think, have articulated very clearly the climate and process of repression, persecution, criminalization, and the disarticulation of civil society. Very clearly, your report and testimonies have shed light on the systematically muting your voice and the voices of accountability and transparency as it relates to human rights violations that are taking place. I think your report has been, and the testimonies have also been very specific in pointing out the different methods of this system of repression. And it has also pointed out the impact that it has had on families, on human rights defenders in general, on their families, but on the voices of people who are in dire need of help to be set free. What I want to request from you is to shed a bit more light in the different testimonies. It has been mentioned, the impact on families, on children, on mental health, and in that regard, what the international community, what are your recommendations in terms of the coordination you want the international community as well as the Commission to have in that regard? So the families, the impact on the families, the impact on mental health, and in that regard, what do you wish from the international community? Thank you.
Thank you very much. El relator Pedro
Pedro Vaca, Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'd like to extend a warm greeting to all of you here, and I'd like to especially thank those organizations that have requested this hearing. And it's always very frustrating to see that the Cuban state is absent, as usual, in a very symbolic way. I'd like to also thank the organizations for the high technical quality of your input and also the information that has been collected. And in the case of Cuba, there is greater difficulty in obtaining information, so it should be a double recognition for that. I also want to thank all of you for your testimonies and your experiences that you've shared with us during this hearing. And I want to very specifically request that there be no retaliation against those people who have shared their experiences or the experiences of their family members. Since many of these matters are extremely sensitive, and there's a history in terms of what happens when this is done, and that's why I express this request of Cuba. So during the last 3.5 years, some monitoring efforts have been done in Cuba. And in terms of also my experience as a rapporteur, I can ratify a few of the points that have been made here. I'll go back to 2021. My office at the time was in contact with people in Cuba who spoke about leadership and the protests that were taking place. And there were claims, as we saw in almost all countries of the region in 2021, and protests also happened there and in other countries of the region, and they were monitored. But then came repression against those protests, and then we began to see some differences. It's commonplace that when protests happen and we monitor them, civil society organizations provide numbers which are a bit higher than the ones provided by the state. But it was like hundreds to zero. That was the difference between the numbers of the civil society organizations and the government in Cuba. When we look at protests, it often happens that the state, through dialogue, and this is what our commission asked for in our reports. They tried to solve the issue, but that dialogue does not exist in Cuba. What happened was that there was a very harsh stigmatization of these people with a system that monopolizes the public media. And our office recorded this, and we see also that Cuba is one of the countries on this continent where there is no guarantee for freedom of expression in the terms established by the inter-American system. And perhaps towards 2022, 2023, that's the time when we saw the most painful aspect of the monitoring, and it is in agreement, in alignment with what has been said during this hearing. It became much more difficult to be in contact with people there, to understand what was happening on site. I experienced that myself, and we started to hear these very painful stories. My children, my brother, my sister, my partner, I leave the country and then I'm not allowed back in. And it's, I think, very well expressed by the organizations, and I thank them for it, since they characterized it as a neutralization of leadership. And I thank them for that, because we've seen that as well from my office, and this agrees fully with what has been expressed during this hearing. The democratic credentials of a state are directly proportional to the right to freedom of expression and association. The Commission, in its report, speaks about a constellation of rights that make up the right to protest: freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom to peacefully congregate. In countries that have convictions and institutionality, in countries that believe in pluralistic deliberation from differing points of view, well, so the freedom of association is essential for almost all spheres of public discourse, so that states, through criticism, through peaceful association, can be made to improve. And that's why dialogue is so important. And unfortunately, that is something that we do not see here. And we truly regret that, in spite of the efforts of the Commission, of the Special Rapporteurship for Freedom of Expression, that attempt to choke out, to shrink public spaces is ever present in Cuba. And in this regard, I also wanted to express that even with all those obstacles, there is in Cuba a civil society that continues to work for freedom. I'd like to ask about two very specific things that were mentioned during the hearing. The first question has to do with whether it's possible to visit people who are imprisoned because they have been political leaders or because they have tried to exercise their freedom of expression. Is this something that is allowed? Can they be visited, or is it difficult to do? The second question is related to a comment that was made to me in a different venue, but related to the Cuban situation. It seems that this is aimed at a generation. What is the impact that this situation is having on young people, on youth in Cuba? Is this something that has been taken into consideration? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Rapporteur. Now we give the floor to Tania Renal, our Executive Secretary. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the commissioners who are with us at the table. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to have you here and to listen to you when you come. and you speak, that in itself is an act of resistance and a revolutionary act. You are making visible what is happening in the region. Before the regulation of the Commission was modified in 2013, the Inter-American Commission was already conducting very clear monitoring and follow-up on Cuba. And after the modification of the regulation in 2013, Cuba is now still in Chapter 4B. So we've had Cuba in Chapter 4B for about a decade now, where it is a chapter of special concern showing those countries that are of particular concern to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. And so the Commission, and I wanted to say this vis-a-vis what Sophia was saying and what I was hearing, that the Commission needs to be present. It needs to continue to be there. But the Inter-American Commission put out a report in 2020 regarding the human rights situation in Cuba. It's provided several follow-up hearings, cautionary measures. In 2023, we had a hearing on imprisoned people who were beneficiaries of precautionary measures. We've put out numerous press releases talking about the increase in criminalization, arbitrary detention. So we have been present. So I think it's worth to ask, what have we been there for when in multilateralism, one of the main rules is that the states have to be willing to engage in dialogue, and we don't have that from the Cuban state. And I think this is when the Inter-American Human Rights Commission becomes the conscience of the Inter-American system. A decade of having Cuba in Chapter 4B, that frequent monitoring where we've had Cuba as the focus of analyses of what is happening on the island. So then we also become the historic memory of violations of human rights. So in the Inter-American conscience, in some way, when the time for transitional justice comes, when there is a different system and opening to democracy, that's when we will be able to say, this is what is happening, this is what happened, and this is what should not happen again. And that is why it's so important to have these hearings with people coming from Cuba, civil society that continues to work tirelessly, documenting cases, because our efforts complement each other. We could not understand the work of the commissioners. We could not conceive of it without the work that you do. So thank you very much for that. And we also want to express our full solidarity with you. We understand there's a state that does not dialogue with the Organization of American States or with the Inter-American Commission. There are two colleagues that I see on screen. I'm sorry I cannot see your names. They're too small. But one of you talked about an increase in feminicides. And I'd like to know, what is the basis of this conclusion that you've reached? Is it because of an increased number of reports, or is it because people have been identified as such, as victims of femicide, or, and this would not be minor, is there a record that civil society has, which would also be important? And this is especially relevant because when we talk about Cuba, we often talk about the shrinking of civic spaces. That's what we talk about, that shrinking of the right of freedom of expression. But very often we don't think, as Commissioner Ralón was saying, how there are differentiated impacts on different people, and perhaps there's a different impact on women. I'd like to know from you, if you could tell us, what is the source of this data on an increase in femicides, just so we have it as a source. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I will intervene just in the sense, first, of echoing what was already said. The commissioner, both commissioners, the special rapporteur, the executive secretary, and to acknowledge the work that has been courageously and vigorously done by the civil society organizations and by those people who are testifying as well, which is so important to protect this historical memory and the inter-American conscience. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. Secondly, I'd like to open up something else, a different, because within this whole narrative that I have listened to, where it has been spoken about gender violence, precariousness, threats, loss of freedom, an ambivalent family code where there could be a loss of responsibility from parents because of, as this executive secretary said, the feminicides have increased 153%. This is extremely serious or grave. So where are the judges in Cuba? And this is something that I would like to speak of, because I would like to believe or think that there are people in the operation of justice that have a different take in a penal or criminal sense. Perhaps there is a stronger repression to the criminal adjudication, to the judges. But in the family environment, is there any way that perhaps judges are understanding things in a different way? Cuba ratified the rights of the child. Is this being applied? Should judges be taking a look on how to apply this convention? And perhaps it's a way of the regime to trying to have these relationships between families then so they can affect the dissidents. So is there anything that we have to take care of regarding judges? So this is another point. I will leave it here. And now civil society has the floor for another 30 minutes to respond and dialogue and have further dialogue. Thank you very much. First, it will be Yanelis by Zoom. Then it will be Camila to answer questions about family. And then we will go to Julio to speak about the judges, because he comes from Cuba and he has more experience in this. And then we can reinforce some of the questions or answers if they're not being answered altogether. Yanelis, Camila, and Julio, that's the order. Perfect, thank you very much. I will begin a bit about the differentiated treatment of activists and women that have been detained and the impact on families. On the report, you can see the statistics that we have obtained just between 2022 to 2024. The 372 events of repression have been written down because of the protest on July 11th. There is a pattern that is being repeated, and with different parts of it, such as harassment, and then interrogation of the young people in a family, threats with imprisonment, avoid that solidarity within the community is activated or is done or exists because of these actions against the families, and of course forbidding people to leave the country. This is the term that the regime uses, as person of interest, and another term is the forbiddance of leaving the country and also entering the country. We have several cases registered about this. And something else that is important, after the 11th of July, there was violence, physical violence against family members and psychological violence against family members of those protesting. I would like to mention some examples. The mother of the political prisoner, Mirka Ibanez, she was beaten up by someone on a motorcycle after she left church in Camagüey. This is a practice they do. And again, it goes back to the peaceful protest of the ladies in white, Damas de Blanco. This is a civic way of protesting. And Irma Ravelo, who is the wife of another political prisoner, Jeremy Salcin, who in March was cited to go to the police in Artemisa, and the officer that interrogated told her, leave all of that, leave all those things, the defense of human rights, and specifically the fight for the freedom of her husband. So there is repression against, apart from the family. We also stressed that it leaves the political context. We have also, on part of this, those activists that fight against gender violence for many years. And I'd like to jump from here to the data that I provided on feminicide. And in 2019, there was something founded that registers or takes account of the feminicides in Cuba. And we're based in Madrid for that. And they have to work anonymously because in their work they're being persecuted. It's criminalized if they were found out. So there is high risk. Just because we're monitoring the cases of feminicide and gender violence. The methodology that we used, that the Observatorio de Igualdad, the Equality Observatory in Spain, we have specific categories: social feminicide, family feminicide, trans feminicide. The most traditional is between a couple. So starting from this, we take these statistics. There are no public statistics. The government, of course, these are a sub-register. The regime is completely silent about this data. They have not mentioned any statistics. So in the last few months, we have some numbers, and they have vaguely mentioned some things. The regime, they don't tell what their methodology is. We cannot do any follow-up of the numbers we have. 2023 was the most alarming year because there was 250% increase, and this is an analysis that was done, the Latin American map of feminicides does, and Yo Si Te Creo in Cuba. These are independent Cuban platforms, are part of this, and this analysis was done by that platform based on data or joining it to the data of the rest of the region. And we can visualize, we can see then that in 2023 there were 89 cases, and in 2022 we had 36 feminicides. But it's important to know that seeing these cases also has probably made it that we receive more claims of feminicide, and people are getting to see how important it is to mention or denounce these. And the process of triangulation that we're doing is very important so that we are able to include these numbers in the different typologies that we're using. So the most important thing is that we're registering them, and at the end of 2023, we began a second request of a law regarding gender violence. This was not included the last time in the legislation process, so it's something that is very alarming because in 2024 alone, we already have 10 verified feminicides. And because of machismo that does exist in Cuba, there are no public statistics, but there are no homes where these women can go. There are no special police departments where anyone can go denounce, or a hotline that works regarding this type of violence. And there's an institutional crisis that, of course, leaves Cuban women in a very vulnerable situation. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about this, we can send you the reports that the Observatory is doing every year. We will finish and publish the last one at the end of March, by the end of March. And we include and we invite the international community to pressure the Cuban government so that they start moving on this. Thank you. I am Camila Rodriguez, reiterating my name as you requested. So I'd like to give you some numbers or statistics on documentation of violence and human rights of women in prison. Last year, the Documentation Center had 193 incidents that were registered. That these are conditions of infrastructure in the prisons in a general manner. On the other hand, 151 claims of denial of medical attention and health issues, and 155 of the claims had to do with harassment and repression in the prisons. So during the year, these events are putting women in these punishment cells because they were expressing political views, or beatings, torture, such as intimidating interrogatories, and they are handcuffed and leg cuffed while this is happening, and they're exposed to violence. They are denied the right to go out in the sun. They deny their conditional freedom or for freedom regions, and they deny to go into a less severe prison. These are many of the things that are happening. So I think it's important to mention all the types of incidents that have to do also with maternity. We can evaluate these in two ways. First, those women that are separated from their children and their family in a general sense, and by great distances. We've seen the case of Amara Nieto, who was separated from her children, going from a province from the east and then placed in a prison in the west, and another woman that was separated from one place to the island of Juventud, or Youth Island. And what concerns us most, in the last few weeks, Sandra communicated with somebody in their family that it was her intention to commit suicide if she was not allowed to see her children. She would then inject the HIV virus to herself, and she thought that way they would get her close to her family. But we have seen no significant any changes in her case. Moreover, in the following days after this, we had 2 more reports of 2 other prisoners in the East that tried to take their lives because they wanted to see their family and children, because they be placed in a regime that is not taking their freedom away. So we use the rules of Bangkok. We constantly appeal that this is possible for these women, for mothers, and it has been established that being a woman is a different condition and it has different consequences when you take away their freedom. Another of these differentiated treatments that we have documented has to do with trans women, such as the case of Brenda Diaz, a trans woman who was detained during the 11th of July protest. She has been impeded from using women's clothes and leave her hair long, amongst other actions that are of the same nature that deprive her of the gender she has selected. Another type of incident that we've been able to document based on these differentiated treatments has to do with maternity in the prison. The Center of Documentation published with another independent publication an article that tries to show this type of events. There is a woman in Cuba that has been detained because of protests, Listaris Rodriguez, and the authorities, where she is imprisoned, are trying to induce an abortion. For many years, she's wanted to be a mother, and until now, she had not been able to be pregnant. But she is trying to have her baby, and they're trying to induce, by repression and other methods, an abortion. They're trying to induce that. So we've been able to document cases, not as recent as Melky Faures, for instance, who was a member of Umbaco, and she lost a baby in prison because of the lack of regular conditions for a woman that is pregnant and can then have her child in prison. We have also seen how other mothers reported at different times in the past and now that lack of nutrition or adequate ventilation has been the cause for them to be sick or have their babies get sick. So we can mention other cases. We have a case, Diana de la Caridad González Lac, it's a recent one, Nancy Rodriguez, at the beginning of the 2000s, series of names that we can share with you further on in a report on this that we have just recently published. But I also would like to allude to another type of specific violence against women that has to do with violence such as Yunaki Linares recommend to the international community to do regarding this, of what Yaneli spoke of and what I have been speaking of. I think it would be important to put pressure on the Havana regime so that they include in their guidelines that there could be visits to those people in prison, and to pressure them to apply norms such as the rules of Bangkok. And I think that it is also important, if these women that are imprisoned, they're not applied a subjective measure, then at least if they are constantly medically followed for their physical and mental health, so that they're medically assessed, because this is an alarming thing that we see in the social media, what's happening to them by being deprived of freedom and seeing their family. So that would be the recommendations that I would make. Thank you. Julio Ferrer from Cubale in Havana. Regarding the judges, to be able to understand how this works in Cuba, we should begin by saying that there is not a three-power or different states. The judges and everybody are subordinate to the state. So whatever they do is dictated. Whatever the executive power is interested in doing regarding a case within the judicial system. I would like to give you examples of my own personal experience. Recently, by the end of last year, I submitted a demand in front of a different courtroom that came about because of the new constitution, and this was the Constitutional Rights Court. And what I always claim every time that the exercise of being a lawyer is still monopolized by the national organization of this collective attorneys group, and anyone that is not a member of that organization, which is subordinate to the Ministry of Justice, cannot act as an attorney in front of the courts. So a space where they do allow for someone that has an attorney's title, they can only do it at a personal level. So my lawsuit is based on that the National Assembly should promote a law or pass a law that would implement the right of freedom of expression and freedom of association. For this to happen, the Cuban state, after the Constitution was approved, established a legislative chronograph where they put all the specific laws that would have to do with all these different constitutional precepts. So freedom of expression, freedom of protesting, and freedom of association. There should have been a law that passed that would do or refer to this, but in September of 2020 is when it should have happened. That right is related to what happened on July 11th. So the Cuban state reformulated that chronograph, that timeline, this legislative timeline, and the passing of that law that would include all of these rights. Personally, I submitted a petition to the National Assembly so that this law, telling them that perhaps they'd forgotten about that law, and they said yes, that I had included it, but they had excluded that law, but that as a private citizen, I could try to ask the Assembly to include that law. But what does happen in reality? Citizen action to propose something to the National Assembly, every time we do it has more obstacles. We are more requirements. The main requirements that at least 10,000 citizens have to sign on to this and promote this. And they should obtain from the authorities, from the National Electoral Council, a document that attests that you're a good citizen, that you are a good elector, that you have no impediment or nothing against you to do this. But in order to obtain that document, it's like going to the moon, because it is never done that the Constitution says that a citizen could propose a law. But because of this denial, I presented my claim to the Sala de Amparo, and the Sala de Amparo responded that it was not their jurisdiction. And that is what that court has to take into account. In Cuba, there are no judges because they're not independent. Judges obey. If the authorities decide, then you cannot go into the court room or the courthouse. So for that reason, I was detained and taken to the 4th police place in El Cerro. They took me into a room without any legal basis, and then some people from the repression group came and they said, the demand, what your request is being done correctly, legally, but you must understand that here in Cuba, we are the ones in power, and for as long as there's the revolution And if we understand, if we want to violate the law, we do or we don't. That was the tribunal, the court, agreed with what they had first said, which, yes, your claim is all legally presented, but we are the bosses here. So this is an experience that I wanted to relate to you so you can see what is happening with the judges in Cuba and attorneys. I used to belong to this collective office of attorneys when I began to exercise my profession as an attorney. The authorities said they had to throw me out, and they did. So I tried to do what I can independently, and there is an impact. Because in my community, many people come to me when they require some assistance legally. But when somebody says to them, be careful with him because he belongs to the human rights people, and human rights, this term in Cuba, is taboo. It's like a danger thing. It's a dangerous thing. So this person that had come to me asking and left and asked for his documents and papers back and never again spoke to me. So that's the situation with the judges in Cuba. Well, to conclude, I wanted to speak a few more things about parental responsibility when we say it's diffused. There's an article that demands of parents to educate their children and to have love for the country. And these are ideological impositions, which is what they use to threaten activists. And this is backed by a crime within the penal code, that is, actions that go against the development of a child. And this has been frequently used against activists that are mothers, not just to take their children away from them because they say this, but if I'm going to put you in prison, then there is this other crime. So regarding what to say to the international community, and because of what Tania, the executive secretary, mentioned, that the commission, I think that the work of the commission has been exceptional to make what's happening in Cuba visible, make it known. I think that there's enough evidence so that the measures could be taken, the necessary measures, but taking advantage of being here, of the people that are here, we think that the commission can also go to the state, that the state will perhaps respond to, the United Nations, for instance. I think that that is in one of our last petitions. It'll be a periodical examination of the Cuban state to eliminate all discrimination against women. So we wanted to ask the commission that based on that information that you have been compiling, you can participate in that mechanism so that you can provide information to the United Nations group that's doing this. So that is my request, and I don't know if my companions here want to add anything else. That would be all. Thank you very much for listening to us, and of course for doing the follow-up of what is going on in Cuba. Thank you.
I'd like to add a comment about the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Children. Cuba has ratified it, and it's been revised by the committee, the last one in 2022. But the committee itself has recognized that there are profound violations of the human rights of children and adolescents in Cuba. Paragraph 28 of the final observations, of the latest final observations, indicate that there is a deep concern about reports of abuse and mistreatment in detention of youth after the protests of 2021. It's a much broader report, but I think this shows us the reality that these especially vulnerable groups are facing, as are children and young people. So they ratified it, but in practice you see that violations continue, and as our Commissioner Ralón mentioned, there are systematic violations of these rights on the island, and they have a differentiated impact on women, children, adolescents, LGBTI, Afro-descendants, and other groups.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We thank you for this opportunity to have this hearing. We are glad that you are here with us. And now we will declare an end to this hearing. Thank you very much.